this is the video for language specialists, whether you're teaching French as a second language, FSL, or English. My name is Erin Ochoa Whelan.
And I'm Stephanie Winters. I'm the French Immersion Secondary Consultant.
Yeah, and we're just going to have a conversation about how to apply like reading strategies and just reading in general in the classroom. And this is just meant to be kind of food for thought, but things just to kind of get you thinking about how can I realistically work on reading and help my students work on their reading when they're in front of me for those 45 minutes a day. So let's talk about reading and how important reading is in a language room.
Well, I think when we ask that question, we need to also ask, how are we working on reading comprehension? What are we asking our students to do while they're reading? And just kind of thinking about how this relates to our program of study and our curriculum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like reading is only one of the 6 strands in English. I don't think FL is set up that way, but I think it still does kind of take over. Reading and writing always rise to the top as the most important skills that we want to help a student develop.
Yeah, especially at the junior high level, because you're hoping now that they're working through that reading to learn phase and not just learning to read. Now we know, because of a multitude of factors, our students are coming to us without all of the reading skills that they need. And so how can we address that in our classroom?
And then also, because we have those students for such short blocks in a day, how do we deal with the fact that there are so many different areas of skill for readers, right? We have students who are reading excellently, and we have students who are struggling.
I think that piece is really important to always consider when we're planning. We need to give students choice, and that choice can be in the texts that they're reading, or it can be in the tasks that you're asking them to do. But one piece that needs to remain consistent is the strategies that you're working on. And so that can look different in every classroom, but if you focus, let's say, on one particular reading strategy in a class or in a week, then regardless of the text that you're using or the task that they're doing, it needs to reference that reading strategy. And students need to be explicitly taught how to use the reading strategy. And that comes from modeling, that comes from whole group reading, that comes from supports provided by the teacher to get them to an independent reading situation. So that all comes back to planning and planning for instruction appropriately.
So on the subject of like modeling strategies, can you just kind of go into some of the strategies that you've used in a classroom?
Yeah, so I think in the past, one thing that I tried to do in my French language arts class is focus on a strategy in a week. And so I'd have a mini lesson at the beginning of the week where we would look at the reading strategy. We would talk about when to use that particular strategy. Let's say inferencing, for example. When would we apply that strategy? What types of texts would we use that strategy to help us understand? And then throughout the week, that would be the strategy constantly referenced. And then when it came time to giving students the opportunity to read independently, there would be a task where they would have to apply that particular strategy while they read independently.
I've been talking to English teachers a lot this year about annotation, and it's just one of those things where the students need constant exposure all the time, repetition to kind of get that under their fingers. Because yeah, independence is like, of course, a noble goal, but it's a long-term goal. It's not going to happen in a week for all. For some it might, right? For those students who pick things up like that, no problem. But for others, and I think with these reading screeners, the focus is and should be on those readers who struggle. It'll have to be just over and over and over again until it's so boring for them. But that means it's also maybe natural to them or familiar, right? And that's a good thing.
Yeah.
So besides inferencing, what are some other kind of strategies that come to mind that?
I mean, definitely in a language context, explicit vocabulary work is one, and not just random words, but strategies to help them understand words, looking at root words, looking at all those pieces so that when they come across an unknown word, they have some skills to help them decode it or try to decipher its meaning.
Students that are, for a bunch of reasons, will come with less of those strategies already from elementary, right? So we're thinking very explicitly grade 7 and grade 8, I guess. Just when you're encountering words in the classroom, hopefully when reading aloud, that you acknowledge like the strangeness of those words. Like I think that is also huge to say to a student, not, oh, you should know this, but like, oh no, it's normal you don't know this. It's a very strange thing to see 3 vowels in a row, for example.
As the teacher, we need to model reading for our students when possible, because there are words that you will see on the page, but maybe never hear spoken out loud. Also, that gives you the opportunity to talk about how you're applying certain reading strategies, and you're modeling those for your students, showing them how a good reader thinks while they're reading, what questions they ask, because of course the goal is for them to be able to apply these strategies and adapt which strategies they're applying as they're reading.
Reading out loud is something that I would challenge, all language teachers to do in their classrooms, especially if it makes you uncomfortable to do that. Because not just like the whole empathy thing of like, I don't feel good doing it, well, neither do your students, but also developing and modeling, like improving fluency. That you have those students who, in their heads, their voices don't go up when they see a question mark, so it doesn't really occur to them that it's being asked a rhetorical question, or there's a question in dialogue, where if you do that and say, look, I did that because, they're more likely to be able to do it on their own. So in this case, we're talking about texts that you've chosen for the class, texts that, for study, whole class study. And I think that's something else that I would push English teachers specifically. Well, I don't know, push, because we don't always have a choice. But a lot of those texts that we kind of gravitate towards, what I'm noticing, short stories, sometimes even novels, they can be classics. They can be of old, right? And sometimes they have language patterns or language that we don't really use anymore, And so in that case, I guess you would either decide to kind of give a context lesson, like, well, back in the day, they said, wowza, I don't know what, or to find a text that is kind of published closer to now, that has things that sound a bit more natural to students' ears, so they see that their own speech patterns reflected in the text that they're reading.
But it brings in that cultural piece too. You can have a discussion about a lot of if we're doing a novel, or if we are working on a particular text and it is from, let's say, another country or just another part of Canada, and they have different phrases and different ways of speaking, it brings in a good conversation to have and make those cultural connections, which kind of leads to the question of the novel study. And is it good? Is it bad? Should we do a novel study? Should we not? Kind of looking at that. And I think the big thing is to frame why you're doing the novel study. What are the objectives of the novel study? What curricular outcomes are you working on specifically, and what are you hoping the students get from it? If those things are clear, I think it can be structured in many different ways that are effective and that can help improve students' reading comprehension.
Yeah, that's one thing that I will confess. I'm not saying never, but maybe never. I don't know. When I've taught texts, actually I'll say this outright, never, right? If I'm teaching a film study, I know that I am helping a student look at film or visuals in a way they haven't before, just because it's not, I guess, covered in elementary, I don't know. But I'm giving them language they haven't seen, they recognize angles, they start to the meaning and the symbols, etc. And that's kind of cool. But I will confess that I don't think I have ever approached print text that way. Maybe poetry, actually, but I feel comfortable teaching poetry. But I don't know if I've ever taken up a novel and said or thought, one way or the other, by the end of this novel, the student will be a better reader than when they started. I don't think I have. And I think that's what we're trying to get going with this kind of whole reading screeners. All teachers, not just the language teachers, but all teachers have to be kind of thinking that. I will be part of the reason why at the end of next month, the student will be a fraction of unit closer to being a better reader. And that can be tough when you're picking one novel for every kid, right? Especially given the diverse learning needs.
It can provide opportunities to model the reading, to apply the reading strategies, and for them to work with their peers, which can also be very powerful. So I think when deciding whether or not to do a novel study, really just think clearly about what are the intentions, what are the objectives for your students.
Yeah, and I mean, those intentions will always come from the program of studies, right? Like the curriculum. But I think that one thing that might be in conflict or in tension with that would be teaching reading strategies versus teaching like the content of a text. So not like curricular content necessarily, like identifying rising action or tension or climax or whatever, but the content of like a novel, right? This is the scene where so-and-so eats a sandwich, or just like kind of those sticking details, right? When you're looking at, I guess, whatever you're teaching, when is it that those details can fall away in favor of an explicit reading strategy that a student can take forward and apply elsewhere? Because that's really the point.
Yeah, you want them to be able to transfer these reading strategies when it comes time for them to read independently, whether that is in the language arts classroom, whether that's outside of the classroom, or in the other curricular areas. That is our goal.
I've heard from teachers who do love the novel study that part of what they love about it is like the themes that can come up in a novel. You can get complicated. You can see a whole character's like life unfold, and then students can kind of get involved in that. So those would be the things I wouldn't kind of get rid of, right? But it would be the things like getting stuck on the details. Do I have to give like a details quiz or the chapter thing to keep track of the reading? I would say if I could I would put that aside, pick out 3 or 4 difficult, challenging words from that chapter instead, and do like some orthographic mapping or some morphology stuff, just so that the student can, through the process of repetition, say, oh my God, she's taking words apart again. And it's like, yes. So that when you're reading independently, on a test, on the bus, whatever, you can do that yourself. Like, this is the gift that I'm giving you. They don't think it's a gift, but it's a gift, which then takes us to independent reading. Because I think that is an unspoken goal of a novel study, right? To say, like, now that you understand, like, where to pick theme from and how characters' arcs work, that ideally, when you're reading on your own, when you're reading independently, you can appreciate and enjoy those things. But when it comes to independent reading, I think we have some opinions on that too.
Cautions, and just maybe, again, making sure that it's structured. So I think it's one thing to provide students opportunity to have choice in what they're reading, which a lot of times independent reading gives them that, and also provides them the opportunity to apply the strategies that you're working on. But there has to be structure to it. So again, kind of my advice for integrating independent reading into your reading routine would be to make sure that when they're reading, there's an objective to that reading. And whether that be having a reflection afterwards or some type of group discussion where students then they have a purpose for their reading. And I think that there are some resources out there that are really great that can help you set that up. In FLA, I've used a reference called La Lecture Autonome, and there's an English version of that as well, and we'll link that on the video. Yeah, just make sure that it's structured.
Classroom libraries are kind of like an ongoing concern, right? And I know that across the division, there's so many different levels and different kind of levels of access to those kinds of things, which I think we can talk about. But before we get there, I think that allowing students to have independence during their independent reading time, right? So like sometimes you're working on a student's autonomy as well, right? And if a student is choosing a book that you're thinking to themselves, well, this isn't challenging for them, this isn't challenging for a kid in grade 8, they should be reading something a little bit harder, to maybe instead say, maybe this is a sign, if the student is self-selecting for a novel that I don't think is challenging, that they are kind of using the strategies that I've been talking about. So they recognize that when they pick up a different book, they don't recognize, 10% of the words, which is enough to have no idea what's going on. So they put it down because they're not enjoying it. And I think that that's all right. That's part of being an independent reader, is having the will to say, not for me, and to put it away. And so, if you have a student who just keeps picking up that same elementary level book over and over again, for me, I'm thinking, like, let that kid have their comfort read, let them just immerse themselves in the world of Wimpy Kid or whatever it is, because it's one of the nice things about reading is that you have those kind of non-challenging texts that you can return to over and over again. Because like you were saying, professional reading, right, is challenging, but personal reading doesn't always have to be. And I think we all have our guilty pleasure reads or whatever that we like to do.
Exactly. And just remembering that their independent reading level is lower than the instructional reading level because you're there to support them through that instructional reading. You're there to provide them with the modeling and the strategies to use. When it comes to independent reading, it's not going to be texts that are as challenging.
And I just want to interject, like, in the same way that you are there for their instructional reading in English class, the same way that we want the social teacher to be there for the social class, the science teacher in the science class, even the math teacher in the math class, music and music, I could name all the subjects, you get it. But I'm just saying, we don't mean that it's the English teacher's job to carry the student through all of the school's reading. That is not.
No. I think it can be powerful if we make those connections for them, where we help them leverage the reading strategies that they learn in language arts into their other subject areas, but also having those teachers apply the reading strategies that are pertinent to the types of text they're going to see in those subject areas. Because I think that's a piece that is complicated when it comes to reading. It's the types of strategies that are required when.
Well, I think that's huge. Like, nonfiction is something that we're all expected to incorporate into our classrooms, but nonfiction is also the realm of all those other subjects I mentioned. So that's a place where I think it is within your rights, and I would encourage you to be like, what are the strategies that you've learned in social to apply to this graph or this long chunk of boring text or whatever, because that's the job of the teacher. Do we want to talk about classroom libraries and just kind of...
I think just as best as you can, try to keep your classroom library updated. So, periodically going through the books, like Erin said, some books of past may no longer be appropriate for a multitude of reasons. Perhaps the language used is just too difficult or not something that is current, but also culturally insensitive, so we need to be aware of that. And also making sure that we have diversity in types of text, genres, so that when you are providing students an opportunity to choose, they have a variety to choose from. And I think that's how we'll build readers that enjoy reading, which that's always the biggest struggle I find at this age, is for students to enjoy reading, and it's just giving them the opportunity to try and look at various types of books.
Like magazines, like anthologies, whatever you can get. And I mean, like, funding is always an issue, right? We were saying, some of us will have principals that are like gung-ho and they'll let you go out and kind of buy what you need. And there are ways to kind of do this like on a budget, right? So like bookoutlet.ca is a great website for those cheaper books. Buying used, the library book sale. And parent council was one thing I was going to recommend as well, right? Like, if I've had that in the past where, okay, there's no room in the budget for my principal, but if I draft up a letter and send it to parent council, that they'll usually throw me a couple $100 that I can spend online.
And also asking your students, what kinds of books are you interested in, and helping them kind of create that library and picking books that they're already interested in, I think is helpful too.
And the school library, right? Because there are still some schools that have like robust libraries and some that don't, but depending on where you're at. And then also to reach out to us for help with that, because that's why we're here. I think that will be that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.